This conference will now be recorded.
Right. So basically, looking at, in the first learning outcome on this particular unit, equal opportunity and diversity, we basically looked at studying, key terms which are primarily related to, understanding the word equality, uh, discrimination. We looked at one or two acts which are important with regards to understanding this particular concept, which is the Equality Act of 2010. We also looked at understanding what is diversity, and then we looked at the third term, which was inclusion, in the first learning outcome. Now, these three terms pretty much helped us understand the first learning outcome, because when we talk about discrimination, discrimination can be of three different types. It can be prejudice, it can be stereotyping, and it can be oppression. And we went into a bit of details to understand how people communicate and where do we see inclusion being done. So when we talked about examples of including sign language, braille on ATM machines, or in other places wherein people have disabilities, or say for example any sort of visible visible learning difficulty, then in those cases, in order to accommodate people and their wishes, and obviously their background and culture, and then take into account providing care, we need to implement what is called, or observe and implement what is called, equality and diversity. So in this case, equality means we are looking at providing equal opportunities, no discriminating, or let's say making any difference, which is primarily, or taking into account any difference which is coming out of because of diversity. That means people with different backgrounds. Their backgrounds could be health background, it could be where they come from, gender, race, religion, belief, and other things which are related to, for example, their ability. And that could be if they are able and fit, or if they are disabled, then there should not be any discrimination on the basis of that. And then in the end, we what we did was we went into the first assessment criteria, and we looked at with examples how does discrimination happen by labeling, by stereotyping, by prejudice, and oppression in certain cases. That means you don't take into account essentially the wish and say for example the um, preferences of the individual which are receiving care, and then don't allow them to get full information. And without the information that they have, which they don't have, you ask them or force them to make a decision, and that would be termed as oppression. Now, that was covered in the first learning outcome. Now, we also looked at a particular process or principles of psychology, which is basically looking at the ABC effect. Now, if you recall, we talked about the effect, behavior, and cognition, and this, in some form or the other, effect is generally prejudice, because it is we are affected by our beliefs and our experiences of the past. We look at behavior, which tends to be coming in from our background, our upbringing, in terms of our race, culture, religion, values, and that can influence how we deal with other individuals, and that would be classed as discrimination. And when we talk about stereotyping or cognition, essentially any previous experiences that we have had would, kind of cloud our judgment, and that would mean that we might not be able to share all the information with people. And in this case, that would be looking at stereotyping, because we're taking previous experiences in mind, and then basic or into view, and then basically looking at passing judgment, or looking at providing services. And in those cases, we look at the aspect of stereotyping. Now, there were two activities which were asked to complete. Basically, if I show you the presentation, I think there were two activities which I'd asked primarily to look into, so that you are able to clearly understand what is the with the use of examples, essentially, what is essentially prejudice, what is essentially stereotyping, and what is essentially looking at examples with operation. So what is operation, and you look at taking that into account by looking at examples. So here, if we talk about activity, this was a small activity which was mentioned, that you need to explain each of these terms in your understanding, what do they mean? So what does equality mean to you? What does inclusion mean to you? And what does discrimination mean to you? So put the definitions in the rows, and then in the second row, in the columns, put examples of equality, examples of how you look at inclusion, and examples of how where you see discrimination is happening. And then another example that I put forward was to look at, if you are going and visiting a particular location. For example, people go across to a job center, and if they are going to a job center or any sort of a public place, for example, you're visiting your surgery, you have a doctor's appointment, and you are on a wheelchair, for example, you are disabled and you need access on the wheelchair. Now, is the premises advertising that facility, that the premises are suitable for people with wheelchair, or the premises has wheelchair access? So those kind of places wherein, when we look at taking into account the mode of transport, for people which are physically challenged or are disabled, then in those cases, what the organization would need to do is, because of the law, we need the law mandates that if the premises are not suitable, then what we need to be able to do is advertise on our, or basically put a notice on our website or outside the premises to say that this premises are not suitable for people with wheelchair access, or this premises are not suitable for people with disability because there is no lift. So, for example, if you are looking at going to the first floor of a particular building, and that is a place that you frequent because of your maybe receiving treatment, or if you need to go in for, say, for example, maybe meeting somebody, then that particular premise should advertise, or at least put a notice on their website to say that, these premises are not suitable for people with disability because it does not have a lift. And if you're in a wheelchair, or obviously if you use crutches or any other sort of support to be able to walk, then you would need to take stairs, and that would make it difficult for you to reach the destination. So here, keep some pictures in mind, and the idea was to try and create a narrative, and that would mean that how would you look at providing information to individuals in a suitable manner to say that this premise or this particular location that you're visiting, or a public building or a public facility that you're going to, is not suitable, essentially for disabled access. Now, this two activities, if you complete, obviously would help you understand the first learning outcome in a bit more detail, and that is what I had essentially mentioned last time. Now, in terms of today's discussion, we are going to be looking at going into learning outcome 2, which has only got one assessment criteria, and it talks about here basically about how do we look at the origins of prejudice, stereotyping, and and oppression. So this is looking at going into a bit of a background and history into understanding how we see the origins of these. When I say origins of discrimination, essentially, because discrimination can be meted out in three different ways: by using prejudice, stereotyping, and oppression. So this is what we are looking at covering in today's learning outcome. So before I start, I just want to make sure that everybody is able to hear me okay, and you're able to see my screen, and there is no distortion in the voice. So what I would do is, we will get into, before we get into any discussions on the assessment criteria, we'll look at revising or revisiting some of the definitions of the term that we discussed last time. So the three terms which are key to this particular unit of equal opportunity and diversity are prejudice, discrimination, and inclusion. And in some cases, we will also talk about diversity, because obviously when we talk about equal opportunity, giving equal opportunity means that we are taking into account wish, preferences, cultures, beliefs, background of the individual, and that is why we have to look at inclusion and diversity. Now, prejudice, very clearly, the meaning of the word prejudice basically is something which is unjustified, or it means incorrect attitude. That means usually it is used in a connotation of being negative. That means you are looking at a group or an individual, essentially, wherein you're essentially being prejudiced by previous ideas, previous experiences, or what you've heard, and that is clouding your ability to be able to, be having an open conversation, or having or let's say, for example, building a relationship or providing a particular service. And that would be because you hold certain types of views against a particular type of, race, maybe, or the background which the person comes from, and that would be termed as prejudice. Now, when we talk about discrimination, we are looking at basically discrimination in the form of, again, taking into account characteristics like your background, your values, beliefs, culture, race, religion, sex, marital status, your disability in terms of, in terms of how you fit, or in terms of any disability or learning disabilities. And when you take this into account, what you're looking at doing is basically, again, you would be indirectly or directly discriminating against the individual, because you are being clouded by some of the, let's say, um, cultural background or information that you take into account while providing that service. Now, when we talk about discrimination, discrimination can be direct discrimination, and discrimination can also be indirect discrimination. So, when we talk about Discrimination Act in particular, and in general, when we go into a bit of detail, what you will generally see is that the Discrimination Act of 2010, which was put into place, it was initially introduced in 1975, but obviously over the years it has undergone revision. Now, this is generally part and parcel of the Equality Act. And when we talk about the Equality Act here, the laws of discrimination, which was Discrimination Act of 1975, have been replaced by anti-discrimination laws, and a single act now has been put into place by the government in the UK, and that basically incorporates inclusion, diversity, and discrimination, and that is the Equalities Act of 2010. Now, when we also talk about discrimination and discrimination types, we talk about two different types. One is indirect discrimination, and the other is direct discrimination. So when we talk about discrimination directly, that means you're treating a person worse than the other because of some characteristics. So in this case, you're basically looking at favoritism, and because of that particular person being more close to you, or that person to a certain extent, then in those cases you're looking at, directly discriminating by giving preference to one over the other, and that would be termed as, direct discrimination. Now, the direct discrimination could be a simple example of that could be when you have a number of colleagues and you're a manager, and a number of colleagues are essentially working, and somebody is coming up, when the reviews come up, and you only promote a particular person which is closer to you, and that would be a case of direct discrimination. So sometimes you would see that in some cases you are giving favoritism, or essentially considering somebody to give more favorable, let's say, opportunities, and that essentially would be direct discrimination. Indirect discrimination tends to be when you put a rule or a policy which is in a particular workplace, and the way you implement that could have an impact on what is the outcome of that implementation on a particular person, department, service, or in a particular situation. And in those cases, what you would generally see, because you're interpreting it in a way which is going to be useful for you, or disadvantageous for the other person, that would be essentially be indirect discrimination. So in this case, you might say that, if you put in an application, for example, say to the council, just as an example, and you put in an application to the council that you would need maybe a disabled badge for your car. Now, if the council does not, send somebody over to do a proper assessment to see why do you require it, or just basically puts the application on hold, you would generally feel that there is indirect discrimination which is happening, because a couple of blocks down the line somebody else has been able to manage it, or somebody is able to get it, and although you provided all the documentation like a doctor's report and other bits, but it is still not led to a decision, and in this case you would feel there is indirect discrimination. Another good example of that would be sometimes when you look at boarding a flight. And when you look at boarding a flight, what generally most of the flight attendants and the ground staff does is that they allow women and children first. Now, in some cases, if they allow women and children, but also let somebody else get into the queue and board the aircraft, and you feel that you are standing and you are in the queue, but how come this person has gone in when the person does not have any disability, or is not on a wheelchair, or requires assistance, neither has children accompanying him, but how come him or her has been allowed entry? And that would be a way of looking at how indirect discrimination happens. So there are ways in which we see on a day-to-day basis discrimination happening, and the Equality Act, essentially, which has been put into place at the place of work by the government, which is the Equality Act of 2010, allows for organizations, providers to be able to put policies in place which, when implemented properly, eradicate discrimination at its roots. So it does not allow any sort of discrimination or prejudice or stereotyping or labeling to happen at all, because the policy itself mandates that this is how the things have to be done, and procedural things then follow that course, and that would allow discrimination not to happen. You can see this, something which sometimes happens is when you look at surgeries, some of the surgeries don't have an electronic appointment system. So when you call in or you do a walk-in surgery, and obviously if there's a phone system, there is an audit that can be done to see if there are certain calls which are being given preference or they are going past the list. So all these would be an example of indirect discrimination, because you are not going to see which patient or which caller which is called the surgery is given an appointment. Sometimes when you speak to the surgery and you speak to the people at the reception, they would say, okay, if you're working, then or if you're not working, or if you're a child under the age of 16, or if you are a senior citizen and retired and over the age of 65 or 70, then they would give preference to you taking medical appointments is because of your conditions. That would not be direct or indirect discrimination. That is because it is mandated in the in the NHS that the services to certain sets of sections of people, especially children and old age people, need to be prioritized because their conditions could be vulnerable and obviously fatal. But sometimes you feel that just because I'm working and I've not been able to take an appointment, you feel that the practice nurse or the receptionist has not given you one, because they say, could you call in and come in the afternoon rather than early mornings or late evenings. So in this case, you feel that there is a slight bit of indirect discrimination because of the ability, and here they are not prioritize me although I'm having fever or running fever or whatever condition that you have. And in those cases you feel that can be a way that you generally see sometimes discrimination can happen. Or you've been asked to see the doctor, you've asked to see the doctor, but on that day when you come in for your appointment, you are basically asked to see a clinical nurse rather than a doctor, and you again feel that there are bits and pieces of discussion that you cannot do. You raise a complaint if possible, and that could be looked at from an aspect that, okay, I've asked for a doctor's appointment specifically, but I've been given a clinical nurse because of whatever reason. And that could also be some sort of wait for the reception and the administration team to go through a number of patients, but you feel that you are indirectly discriminated, that okay, somebody's gone in and they've seen the doctor and somebody's gone in and they've seen the nurse. Now, there are lots of examples of discrimination that can be looked at. Now, if we go into, because in the first assessment criteria, we're looking at the origins of how prejudice, stereotyping, and oppression originated, we need to look at some of the examples which help us understand how this, topic has become so important, and why there is acts or legislation in place in most countries to eradicate the discrimination. That means they want to have a fairer society. They want to make sure all citizens within a country get equal opportunity, and that is when the acts and legislations which have been introduced. In Europe, there is similar legislation. In UK, we have the Equalities Act. Along with this, there are a number of other acts which allow discrimination in any shape or form to be eradicated, and we need to look at some of the origins of how this has come about. Now, when we talk about racial discrimination, there are two stark examples that we are all aware of, and probably we have learned or read about this in the history. So when we talk about apartheid, specifically when we look at Africa, South Africa, or in places where British have ruled, in certain colonies they practiced apartheid. That means there were places which were out of let's say out of limits for black people. And in those cases, when we look at a policy of segregation or separateness which was literally followed, that was basically discrimination on the grounds of race. If you're not white, you couldn't go to this beach. If you're white, if you're black, you couldn't go to this pub. Even in other colonies, if you look at where British ruled, they had created these segregation, through the route of applying discrimination, and that particular term was called apartheid. Now, apartheid was a term which was predominantly used in South Africa, and Nelson Mandela, over the years, liberated this, and obviously, now most of the law policies and bits in South Africa are taking into account that because it's a majority country, and non-whites people should also be able to, or essentially native people should also be able to get the same rights and let's say facilities as others. And there's a long history behind it, in terms of, because the British had colonized South Africa. Most of the land was owned by uh, British, and essentially most of the workers within the farms were the local native people, and that created a lot of disparity, and obviously that was racial discrimination. And there's a lot of violence, bloodshed which has happened in Africa, in South Africa in particular, and that was finally removed when the system of apartheid was dismantled and done away with. So between 1948 to the early 1990s, we see this particular system being put into place by British, which had colonized a lot of countries, and obviously as they started to gain independence, this was done away with. Then we look at World War II. So if you look at Nazi Germany, obviously a lot of 6 million Jews were killed in World War II, and obviously some of them were put into concentration camps, and obviously this was a large scale massacre which has happened, and obviously this is again racial discrimination. So Hitler did not, and Germany in those days did not like Jews, and obviously they were made to wear yellow stars to identify themselves visually, and obviously a lot of them lost their lives. 6 million of them lost their lives, in the concentration camps. Now, when we also talk about discrimination, we look at age discrimination. So there are, as I mentioned, lots of different types of discrimination. You have direct discrimination, indirect discrimination. You have discrimination which can be done on the basis of age. A simple example that you can think of is, if you're going in, if you've seen a job advert, and that job advert talks about advertising age in the job advert, saying that people between the age group of 19 to 24 only apply, or people within the age group of 24 to 30 only apply, then in those cases, the employer is basically discriminating against people who can be eligible for that particular job. But because they put an age group, that means they're discriminating on the basis of age. And that is not allowed by law. So when you look at job adverts, or essentially, look at applying for a position in a company, if you see that it says able and fit people only apply, that means there's a discrimination happening on the basis of ability, which is disability, or people with learning difficulties cannot apply. So there are different forms. Gender discrimination, again, I would put it this way, that if you look at a job advert wherein, if the surgery, for example, is recruiting staff, and they mention that female candidates only apply, then this will be gender discrimination. Or if they say in certain positions that we only need, say, when security jobs are advertised, if they say men with this particular description or this particular body type with height or this and that apply, then obviously that would be treated as gender discrimination. Now, when we also look at what are the different types of prejudices which can exist, and how would this be treated when we look at different people. So when we talk about discrimination, we know there are different types. We can also talk about harassment, victimization. They would be basically different forms of discrimination. We also need to look at what are the different forms of prejudice. So when we talk about different forms of prejudice, what we are looking at here is basically talking about prejudice, which is essentially happening on the basis of sexism or gender. So you're looking at basically being biased on. So when we talk about the word, prejudice and its meaning, what we are looking at is a preconceived opinion that you have, which can be based on a particular reason or an actual experience. Now, if we look at doing prejudice on the basis of sex, then it will be called sexism. That means, for this jobs, or when sometimes we hear terms like, okay, for HR jobs, females normally are more suited. Now, this is being, this is being sexist in the sense that you are only looking at considering women to apply in those positions. Sometimes you would look at, when we talk about differentiation between prejudice and discrimination, what we then look at primarily is that the difference between the two is that when we talk about prejudice, we are biased on the basis of our thinking because of the experience that we have had, or an opinion that we have got. So you're basically biased on the basis of your thinking because of your past experience or thinking. When we talk about discrimination, we are looking at discriminating against a particular group or an individual type of individual coming, or groups essentially. But this is taking into account their race, ethnicity, religion, health, some of the other things that we talk about, like ability, and we talk about values, culture, and belief. So when we differentiate and talk specifically about prejudice, what we are looking at is taking into account common examples of where people sometimes, because of their opinion and their what they have heard in terms of information, take into account race, gender, nationality, ethnicity, their social status, or maybe their religious affiliations, and then bring them into consideration while making decisions, and that would be seen as being prejudiced. So for example, if I'm if I have not heard good about, say for example, let's say people who have preferences which are generally not accepted in the society. So for example, if I look at LGBT, the reason why LGBT has come about is when we look at indirect discrimination, and when we look at people getting biased or having opinions on the basis of what they have heard or what they are thinking, then in those cases they sometimes discriminate on the basis of that, and that would be that you are not going to provide treatment to people who are identifying themselves as gay, or for example, same-sex marriages. So in those cases, you would generally see prejudice being applied, because although you might not have any ground of understanding, or maybe background in terms of understanding that this is something which is established, but just because you have an opinion and you do not have that liking and you have heard information, what you're going to do is you're going to make a judgment, and that judgment is going to be done on the basis of your opinion and your information that you've heard or got, and that would essentially be prejudice against a certain set of group of individuals. So when in general, when we talk about types of prejudice, what we are going to be looking at is talking into various different types, and one would be that it could be on the basis of racism, it could be on the basis of sexism, it could be LGBT based, it could be disability based, it could be based on religion or background which people come from in terms of their culture and belief, and it could be based on their personality or their physical ability in terms of how they look, or what social status they have in the society. So slight bit of difference it is important for to understand is, when we talk about discrimination, we take into account things like religion, ethnicity, race, and ability and health and other bits, other types which would be discrimination. But when we talk about prejudice, we take into account things like race, we take into account disability, we take into account religion, and in some cases we take into account how a person looks, feels, or talks or behaves in this society, and that would be something which is called prejudice. Now, one of the clear ways that we see a term which is originated over the years, which shows prejudice, is anti-Semitism. So when you have views which are basically conflicting with views of what and how Jews believe, then you are considered to be, or if you met out a behavior which is going to be slightly different from how you meet somebody from another community and how you meet a person from a Jewish community, and if you're discriminating or showing differences in terms of how you go about treating that individual or meeting with that individual because of their background, and in this case their religion, you are looking at indirectly being prejudiced, and that is being anti-Semitic. Now, if we look at the same aspect of Islamophobia, or people who have, if they see that, okay, after 9/11, this became quite prevalent, that people with beard or, wearing some sort of a headscarf were, prejudiced, or basically, victims, essentially because they thought that these people are the ones which are primarily, which has caused, this particular outbreak, and, they could be terrorists and things like that. So here you're being biased by your opinions and what you've seen or heard, and in those cases that would be termed as prejudice. Now, this is very important to understand, because there are very small but subtle differences between what is prejudice and what is discrimination. And it is important to understand that this can be meted out, and sometimes these terms can be, say, for example, um, used interchangeably, but they are very, very different. So if I say, are prejudice and discrimination the same thing? No, they are not. Prejudice is primarily talking about the negative attitude, or the opinion that you would met out because of the information and experience or past experience that you've had. And discrimination is about when we take into consideration their background, their race, their religion, their beliefs and culture, and where people are coming from. And then you have a negative aspect of applying that against people, and that would be termed as discrimination. Is that clear? Any questions on this so far? Okay.
So
Yeah.
more or less, there's a thin line between discrimination and prejudice, because
Yes,
they're
they are
so
different.
similar. Yeah, from even your explanation, it seems like they're so similar. So one's based on just the negative opinion, and while the other is based on race, culture, and all the others. Yes.
That is correct, yes. So when we talk about prejudice, we will be talking about maybe some of the same factors which will be taken into account, but it will be the opinion, or it will be the past experience which will allow, or basically cloud your judgment, and the way you deal with the person in that or a group of people, you will basically be negative in your attitude. So prejudice will be related to attitude, and discrimination will be related to aspects that you will use, which are like your gender, your sex, your background, your culture, your values, and you will have and use these to create a difference in terms of how they apply to the individuals. So the best way to understand the difference between the two is look at the way you would deal with a person. Just because you're dealing with somebody that you know is from a particular background, but your attitude in terms of providing that treatment or that service would be different. But when we talk about discrimination, the way you would provide that service, the outcome of that would be different from individual, because you are taking into account their race, background, ethnicity, culture, sexual orientation, ability, and other things. So an example here would be, I might provide and serve, if you go to Argos, for example, and you ask for something, the same customer service person, somebody in customer service would serve you by greeting you, by obviously making a conversation, and then helping you to pick out the right product. And that would be because the person is aligning with you, or maybe likes you or likes your personality, and here his attitude towards providing the service that you have come into, or the product that you come in to buy, would be more congenial. But if I look at and that would be, the person is providing you the service without prejudice, because they are having a positive attitude towards you. But the same person, another person, or maybe the same person provides the service to another customer, and that customer, when they've gone in to buy the same product, but the person does not have a conversation, just brings in the product, answers the question yes and no. So in this case, the attitude of the person to try and help out and make conversations or provide service to that person is clouded, or basically, not the same as it was done with the first customer, is because he or she has actually taken into account maybe the factors like how you dress, or for example, how you're, say for example, having a conversation, or what your personality is, and and they have been taken into account, and that has shaped the attitude in a way which appears negative, although the person is serving you or providing you the product or the service, but the way in which it is being provided, the attitude comes in, and obviously, he would say, oh no, we don't have it. Do you want to buy or not buy? And the other way would have been to say, okay, I think we don't have this product in, or we don't have an equivalent on this, but I can provide you an equivalent product which would be doing the same functions. Look at this box and this box. So there is a difference in terms of how you've dealt with that person, and that is because you have taken into account their same background, how they dress, personality, and then your attitude is shaped up in providing that service. And on the other hand, you would probably be looking at the personality, but you are basically taking into account after the interaction things like, where they come from, or maybe their personality and overall package in terms of race, sex, religion, cultural beliefs, and then you do it. And then in that case, the negative attitude allows you to provide the service, but in a very different way, which would not be very congenial for the customer, and the customer would not feel that this is something I would like to buy, or maybe the customer might change his mind because they would say, okay, this is not something which is coming in, and maybe he or she is not understanding what I'm here to buy. So the differences would be on the basis of attitude and taking into consideration the traits which we talk about in terms of discrimination, and they could be on the basis of sex, race, and your social status, or your background, and where you come from. So factors and attributes pretty much are very similar, but the way the connotations are and the outcome of that is slightly on the basis of just the attitude and how you consider this in terms of behavior, which is in the case of discrimination. Because discrimination, I don't know whether you recall, but in the first presentation that we discussed, there are three different terms. There is cognition, there is behavior, and there is attitude. So attitude is related to prejudice, behavior is related to discrimination. So the implementation of taking into account race, sex, religion, all that is going to be implemented out or vetted out in your behavior, and that would be discrimination. But when you have an attitude, and that is influenced by the background, sex, race, religion, that would be on the basis of, that would then be what is on the basis of attitude, and that will be shown as what is called prejudice. So you have to keep in mind, when prejudice comes, you think of attitude. When discrimination comes, you think of behavior, and this is where it will be using or helping you differentiate between the two, because they take into account the same attributes in both cases, but discrimination is influenced by behavior or is enacted because of your behavior, and prejudice is enacted because of the attitude you develop because of the information that you have, or the past experience that you have. Is that okay? Okay, with this,
Yes.
now what we are going to do is discuss the first assessment criteria. Now here we talk about the first assessment criteria. That's the only one which basically says evaluate explanations of the origin of these three different words: prejudice, stereotyping, and oppression. Now, when we talk about types of prejudices, we need to understand what are the various types, and obviously the attributes in this case would influence what attitude you develop, and then that attitude will essentially be the outcome of prejudice that you get to see being meted out by an individual. Now, the origins of the word prejudice come, and there are some theories which are to be looked at, and these theories typically include the four common types, which is: one is social identity theory, there is scapegoat theory, there is authoritarian and personality theory, and there is cultural theory. Now, these are basically theories which have been which have evolved over the years, and Tajfel and Turner came up with some of these theories, which are two psychologists which did great amount of study to understand what is prejudice, why it came about, how it enacts in our society, how people put now, sometimes they say, no, I'm not being prejudiced, but they don't even realize that they are being prejudiced, and obviously their attitude conforms to how they are being prejudiced against a particular group of people, or a individual that they're dealing with. Now, these theories, what I've done is I've put 4 slides on each of these theories. So when we talk about social identity theory, this was initially proposed by Henry Tajfel, and he in this theory establishes that the person has, has a tendency to see ourselves as a part of a group. So therefore, what he meant was that when we talk about something in general, what we look at is we look at comparing people with ourselves, and that typically takes the classification on the basis of, or that takes the comparison on the basis of social strata or social classification in the society. So here, what he meant essentially was that when we talk about social identity, you tend to compare people either as your with yourself, or as them, or against yourself. And here, the let's say the basic way of how you align, or let's say disalign yourself, would be using the word that I'm in the group or I'm outside the group. It is either us or it is either them. So this terminology of either you look at saying, okay, no, no, he's like us, and we should we should take him into our group, and or you would generally say, no, no, they are not like us, they are different, their culture is different, their background is different, and they are them, and they are different to us. And that would essentially be the way how people will look at either synergizing or aligning with other individuals in the society. And this was done on the basis of what is called social categorization. And social categorization primarily comes from prejudices in terms of your attitude, whether you look at us or them, you look at I or they, or you look at essentially either you're with us or you're against us. So this theory basically has this alignment, which he studied by looking into the backgrounds and various studies that he conducted, wherein he looked at understanding different situations, people, how they work together, come together, and whether they come together on the basis of understanding of it's I or them, us or them, or it's either you're in the group or outside the group. And that is basically one of the prejudices that he proposed when we talked about social identity theory. The second theory that we talk about is what is called the scapegoat theory. Now, the term scapegoat, I think we've heard about the term scapegoat a couple of times. So when we talk about scapegoat, what you're trying to do is you're trying to blame somebody else for the wrongdoings which have happened in a situation, or if mistakes have been committed. Or what you try and do is, no, you say it's not my fault, it's their fault. And in this case, what you're trying to do is come up with reasons to say and justify that this is not something that you have done, this is something that somebody else has done. And what you do is you put all the blame, or essentially you try and put the blame by creating a lot of reasoning around it. And that would be termed as, you're trying to sometimes you say, they made me a scapegoat, but they've not addressed the real problem. They've addressed, and in those situations, what you tend to do is blame the other person for the wrongdoing, or a group of people for the wrongdoing. Now, in when we talk about the scapegoat theory, what we are looking at is, here generally what you see happening in the society is people with higher social strata or higher status in the society are able to use their higher position to basically banish or blame, or let's put it this way, say that these problems are occurring because of somebody else or people in the lower positions. So in this case, scapegoating theory essentially establishes that when we talk about how people would essentially look at blaming others for their problems, they will be looking at doing so because of their social stratification, or for example higher status in the society. And that would essentially be because of the fact that they are able to use their position and their clout to be able to put blame of a mistake, or an outcome which has happened, and they are able to escape from that particular situation. So in this case, when we look at doing a bit of if we dwell deeper into this particular theory, this theory will focus on talking about the act of blaming people who are not in the group. So when we talk about us against them, you are in the group or outside the group. So here the scapegoat theory would be focused on blaming things if they don't go right, or blaming the outcome of things if they have not been implemented properly, and they will blame it on the people who are outside the group. So scapegoating will essentially be the act of blaming people who are outside the group, and people who are inside the group will basically show frustration in terms of why this has not met that outcome. So sometimes you would see that an example here would be that when we look at sometimes talking about that say for example, if there was an operation or there was some sort of a fatality, and the details of that has to be caught into to say why this has happened, or why this could not have been avoided. Then in those cases what you would generally see is people will look at their roles and responsibility, and what they will do is they will align and form a group. Now, I did my bit in terms of medication, I did the change, I did this, I did that, but that person or this group did not do these things on time, and that is why it has led to this particular outcome. So here the person or the group will be looking at putting a blame, and that blame would be put on the other person or the group, and that would basically be prejudice, because what they are trying to do is use maybe their position or their higher strata, or maybe the numbers that they have in the group, to be able to blame people on the other side, which is others or them. And by using this as because of the numbers that they have, or because of the influence they have, or maybe the title or the senior position they have, this would be termed as scapegoating theory. The third one that we talk about is authoritarian personality theory. So here, when we talk about authoritarian personality theory, this is built up on the idea that people with authority would be able to make decisions. They'll be able to comply with the policy and procedures. They might choose not to comply, but they will be able to get away with it because they have the authority. So the buck stops at them, essentially, if we use the term. And that would mean that in some cases, these people with authority essentially would be looking at having the ability to be able to, let's say, prejudice against people who are junior, or maybe do not have, say, for example, a straight line in terms of connection to their boss. Now, sometimes you would see there is a bit of favoritism which happens within the organization. And that favoritism happens is because you're very close to your boss or your manager, and you might want to look at, say, for example, in this case, sometimes when you look at work shifts which happen within hospitals, you generally see that if you wanted a day shift, but you always end up having a night shift, and you have a word and discussion with your manager, and the manager looks into your reasons, but then still also says, no, there is no way that I can change your shift to night shift, because the day shifts are already full, and we have other staff which have given these preferences. So this is something what the person might do is have an ability to change your shift over a point in time, to say, okay, we have a shift pattern for next 4 weeks which are already scheduled, but what I'll do is I'll consider your request, and then once this comes up for change after 4 weeks, we will look at putting you into the day shift, and I'll check with others if somebody wants to move to a night shift for a couple of weeks. Now, if that attitude or that discussion does not happen, then in those cases, the person, if you are a favorite of that manager, or if you're you are generally close to that person, then you would generally see that you will probably be given out what is called a bit of favoritism. And in those cases, because you have a straight line access to your boss, that means you're one-on-one with your boss, you are able to basically use their authoritarian and their personality, and obviously you are able to then only get day shifts as against night shifts. So in this case, what you will generally see, there could be prejudice applied because the individual either does not like you or despises you. And in this case, the person might not transfer you from having, even if you've requested well in advance, transfer you from night shifts to day shifts. So that would be an example of authoritarian personality theory. Now, the last theory that we look at in the case of prejudice would be talking about culture theory. So here we are taking into account prejudice, which can come because when you take into consideration the culture and the background which people come from. So here your judgment is going to be clouded by the fact that you are stereotyped or you are biased against a particular type of people. Now, an example in this case would be an idea of an angry black woman, which is portrayed throughout the media, that sometimes when you say, that this has happened, but the person might be looking at putting a point across, and what you would generally do is label that as the angry black woman, is basically use a stereotype or acronym, which is angry black woman, which basically means that, and this has come across from the American societies, where obviously what they do is they basically portray somebody who's ill mannered and is not able to understand, say, for example, policies and procedures, and wants to, let's say, still discuss and debate those policies and procedures. Sometimes they use this term, and that would be the angry black woman, to say that, okay, that person is ill mannered, is not having, culture, is not coming from a cultural background, and they would not understand this thing. And in those cases, your culture is actually being taken into account, and you're being labeled, and that is clouding the judgment in terms of how you would put things across, or with a different perspective. And if this kind of a prejudice happens, then this is studied, or was, initially proposed under the culture theory, wherein people take into account your background, your race, where you come from, and then they stereotype you, or basically label you, and then essentially, look at using this as a reason to create that prejudice, to say, okay, they wouldn't understand because they come from this background, or, she wouldn't understand, or he wouldn't understand because he is, he is not lived in this place, or, he's not from here. And that would be the difference on, having cultural theory, and using that to look at putting, or being prejudiced from that aspect. Now, when we talk about looking at stereotyping, what we also need to look at is, that's the second bit that we will look at. And apart from prejudice, the second bit is, how did stereotypes originate? So when we talk about stereotyping, and when we talk about the definition of the word stereotyping, what we essentially mean by that is that your views, or your essentially your beliefs, are already influenced by, say, for example, a particular characteristics that you see, or an attribute that you see in the person. So when, what this would mean is that when we talk about social, psychology, a stereotype is generally a belief that is coming across for a particular category of people. It is expected that people might have this particular information, or this particular type of reasoning, because they are coming from this particular background. An example of stereotyping that we get to see is that we sometimes use cliched terms like girls are more docile and than boys, or boys are more aggressive. So this is because of the way we have seen how people act, and over the years, what has happened is, this opinion has become kind of this opinion is solidified, or has become, quite popular in terms of its beliefs. So sometimes what we say is, no, these girls are more docile, or boys are more aggressive, and what you're trying to do is stereotyping them against a particular behavior, without having to look at the package, or how people behave, or individually, come across when you discuss, or, meet them, or maybe work together with them in a particular situation. So having an idea of a particular type of person, and how they would be like, without giving them a chance and getting them to know a bit better, but being clouded by, and having an opinion which is on the basis of what you know, or have information about, would be the idea or concept of what is called stereotyping. Now, stereotyping can be essentially of two different types. They could be positive, and they could be negative. Now, when we also look at stereotyping, I think what we will also need to do is take into account that what defines your beliefs, which, where you come from, and, what kind of sometimes discrimination or prejudice can be applied in terms of, being stereotyped. So that means, one of the things, an example that I've given here, in terms of social roles that we do, we talk about, say, for example, caregivers. So what we generally say is that, if you have a female worker, or a woman basically, giving care, you would generally say that, okay, they are more suited for this particular role in this particular, environment, and that would be stereotyping. So sometimes in our homes as well, what we say is, I work and my wife, she takes care of the family and the house. She cooks. You don't cook. Now, this is a stereotype which has originated over the years in certain societies wherein men are supposed to work and earn a living and women are supposed to stay at home and do a household work. Now, this is a stereotype which has developed over the years because people have talked about it, and generation after generation, this particular opinion has been passed on. But what we have not been able to do is basically give or look at this on the merit basis in terms of what particular type of role the person can do or what he or she likes. And what we have done is used our prejudice or how things have been done in the past, and then basically stereotype to say that women work at home or take care of home, and men work and go out and earn a living. Now, this stereotype has been challenged over the years. In developed societies, men and women are termed equal. There are lots of different acts and legislation which government has introduced, and the reason why this has been introduced is to avoid discrimination, which can happen in the form of stereotyping, because there are three different types of discrimination we talk about, and that is what is in the assessment criteria: prejudice, stereotype, and labeling. And they are all different forms of discrimination. So that is why the Equality Act takes into account that this should not happen, or this should not be allowed to happen within a workplace or within an organization or at a place of work. And people should be able to easily weed out, observe, pick out, and then weed out stereotyping when it happens, because this would mean that you're going to be treating people unfairly on the basis of their opinions that have come up during the generations. And because they've been happening this there have been this instances of they being looked at like that for a number of years, or has on a day-to-day basis. This has kind of become what is called that it is something which is observed, and it is something which is accepted. But sometimes what you have to do is challenge it, and that challenging would be breaking the stereotype, and that is where you would look at doing away with discrimination, or looking at giving equal opportunity to a group of people, and doing away with the opinion on stereotyping to say this is not possible. But yes, this is possible if I look at this on a merit basis, and then consider and having a and have that chat or that discussion with that person. Now, the reason why the stereotypes are also positive and negative, because they can have a negative meaning or they can have a positive meaning. So when we talk about negative stereotypes, one such negative stereotype is when we talk about Mexican American women or Hispanic women. Similarly, when we talk about people who are essentially working as carers or aides within, let's say they work as care support worker within a particular setting in a health and social care sector. What you will generally see is that over a point in time, this particular opinion would get settled, is that if we need carers, we need more of female carers. We need more of female carers because they are more understanding and they are more considerate, more compassionate. But when we look at NHS and we look at the person-centered approach, the basic requirements of how individuals work within the sector, they have to understand the six principles of person-centered care. That means you have to have care, compassion, courage, and then also have the ability to be able to take into account what kind of care has to be given. And that is something which is similar across males and females. It is not something that this would have a different interpretation for people working as carers who are male, or people working as carers who are or females. So in those cases, you would generally see that what we need to be able to do is challenge this negative stereotype, and that is something which has got established over the years, because that is how society has seen it, from an aspect of being put into practice. So women are stereotypes as homemakers, I give you an example, and men as stereotyped as people who basically go out and earn a living. Now, when we look at understanding why this is important, in particular when we look at stereotyping, or why is it important, is because when we talk about intersectionality. Now, intersectionality typically tends to be when we talk about things like because in these health and social care sectors, things are very interconnected. That means it's a big ecosystem. So you have nurses, carers, healthcare professionals, different practitioners which work and provide care to an individual. So care to the individual might not be provided by one particular person or one type of person. So in this case, what we will look at essentially would be that we will look at categorization, which will be done on the basis of social strata, race, class, and gender. And if that is applied to a particular group of individuals or a particular individual, then what we are going to be talking about is leading to a concept called intersectionality. That means there is overlapping of how discrimination can be met out or disadvantage. In some cases, some individuals would walk away with advantage, and some would be, disadvantaged because uh, of how they are grouped or how the categorization has been done in terms of, their particular role within an organization. So intersectionality here is important in terms of understanding prejudice, stereotyping, and oppression, is because it acknowledges that everyone should be given a fair and a unique chance to express their thoughts before, or given an opportunity to, prove themselves before any such decision is taken. So here you would primarily be looking into account and acknowledging that everyone has their own unique experience of discrimination and of in some cases of oppression, and we should consider everything that can marginalize people because of their gender, race, class, or culture, or physical ability that they have. And that, when is taken into account, we look at intersectionality, and that is basically to identify how very or basically to identify how operation can be meted out in different forms. That means sometimes you would say that let's say an example of intersectionality would be that if I consider people getting fair pay. Now, what I would do is, this is a question which has come across time and again, and I think in the news, if you're aware, there was a lot of pressure in the BBC to ensure that people in the same position are given fair pay. But generally, when it was revealed under the Freedom of Information Act, we saw that men in the same position were getting higher pay than women in the same position doing the same work. So here, when we talk about intersectionality, what we are talking about is we were acknowledging that discrimination was happening on the basis of gender, even though the individuals were doing the same job or same type of job, having the same side of responsibility, but this was being done primarily on the basis of, some sort of a prejudice, which was something which was not explained in the system. So here, categorization of individuals had happened on the basis of their, race or background or gender, and that meant that men in the same position were getting more pay than women in the same position getting less pay. And this meant that this was challenged. And when it was challenged, it was found out that obviously this should not have been the case. And in that case, what has happened is that BBC has gone in and obviously looked at one, disclosing the pay of top 20 individuals which are highly paid in the organization, but also at the same time they've looking at equality in terms of gender pay. That means they have looked at equality in terms of pay, and there is no differentiation because of gender. And this has meant that fair treatment is given to the same set of fair treatment is given to people which are coming from the same group or are coming from the same department, which are carrying the same responsibilities. And that is where it is doing away with the example of, or the case of prejudice within organization. So it takes into account multiple factors which could be looking into why this is creating a difference. And sometimes it can be put together on the basis of race, religion, gender. But in order to eradicate this, in order to remove this, we have to be aware of it. And if we are not aware of it, then we need to acknowledge it. And acknowledging it and having the awareness of it is nothing but intersectionality, which means we acknowledge that there are differences, we acknowledge there are differences in terms of our understanding, but we look at working towards bridging these differences, and that would do away with the prejudice that we get to see, meted out in certain areas, like say for example gender pay, or equal pay to when we look at genders or different type of people working within the same role and responsibility. Now, one other quick thing which I would look at in terms of talking about would be when we talk about discrimination. And I mentioned discrimination will always relate to behavior. Prejudice will always relate to attitude. So when we talk about discrimination, we are looking at essentially how people take in information and how they behave against or in front of other sets of people, and that would be looking at essentially the way in terms of how discrimination is meted out. Now, very briefly, looking at origins of stereotyping. So stereotyping originated as a word in the 1850s, and this is particularly a word which came across and was used by the American journalist called Walter Lippmann. And he basically coined this term that people can be biased on the basis of their preferences, appearance, and ability, and what people then tend to do is put and behave in front of a set of people in a particular fashion, and then they would either align them as in the group, outside the group, or relate them to a particular situation. And when we look at terms like angry black woman, things like that, they would be stereotyped on the basis of, okay, she comes from this or he comes from this background, and that is where this particular let's say an attitude would essentially be, or this particular behavior would be shown, not attitude, behavior would be shown by this set of people or individuals. Now, there were lots of theories which have also been proposed in the case of stereotypes. So there is one theory which talks about, which was basically introduced by Katz and Brawley, and this is basically the theory which was proposed in the early 1930s, and it talks about stereotypes being created on the basis of ethnic groups. So here, this particular theory talks about primarily, looking at stereotyping people essentially on the basis of the race they come from or the ethnicity that they have. Now, there is a particular article that you can read which will give you a bit more detail should you want to go into a bit more depth of understanding the origins of the word stereotyping. And I think one of the good articles that you can look at would be on Wikipedia. And if you type the word stereotype, this is going to give you a bit of background in terms of how it originated, where it came from, and why this has become a word which is now synonymous and used quite regularly when we talk about discrimination. Lastly, I'm just going to look at very quickly the origins of the word oppression. Now, what does the word oppression mean? The word oppression comes from word oppress, and it basically means to press against, squeeze, or suffocate. So essentially, when we look at oppression, what we are trying to do is basically ask somebody to do something which is going to go against their wishes. You're going to ask them to do something in terms of their job, their or if you're providing a particular treatment, and if it's not going well, then you're going to not listen to the person and say, okay, that's the only way we can treat this. And in this case, you're doing or providing treatment against the wishes of the person, and you're not taking into account the needs and preferences of the individual. So oppression tends to be providing or having a malicious intent or providing an unjust treatment, and this is because you able to use your power. Because if you're a doctor and you say, okay, no, this treatment has to be done without taking into account what could be the other methods possible, or taking into account the needs and preferences of the patient, then you would say, oh, no, no, this is the only one possible, we need to do this. For example, if there's a heart surgery which is supposed to be done because of the blockage, and the patient has high cholesterol and has a risk to, say, angina or heart attack, then in this case, without looking into the options of whether this can be treated through medication, whether this could be treated through stenting, or this could be something which is workable with the patient because the patient is young, and a change in lifestyle, nutrition, loss of weight, those kind of things could be implemented. But the doctors in this case suggest, no, no, you need to go in for a heart transplant. And if the patient doesn't wanting to go through this as a procedure, but is being clouded or pushed in terms of making that decision by providing information through family members or putting pressure, that would be looking at a bit of oppression. Sometimes you also see that under the pretext or disguise of authority, or essentially primarily, regulation, people would generally use this and say, no, the law mandates it, or the legislation is such that this has to be done. There is no compromise, and you're using the law as a pretext to be able to oppress the opinion or the judgment and the wishes of the patient, and in this case putting pressure by using law or legal regulation, then that would be also termed as oppression. So these are bits that we needed to understand in the assessment criteria learning outcome 2, which talks about just to look into a bit more detail and to see where are the origins of the term prejudice, stereotyping, and oppression coming from. Now, there are lots of websites which you can look at for reading into more detail, but generally, if I talk about to get a good idea in terms of what their background is, where they came from, I would suggest that you could look at typing the word into Wikipedia, and that would give you a detailed description in terms of their background and theory, in terms of where they've come from, how they've come from, and essentially what does that mean. So in terms of background and history, so when we talk about stereotyping, say for example, I go on to Wikipedia, type this particular word, you will get the history in terms of how this originated, where it came from, what are the various types. And similarly, you could do this for the word prejudice, and in general for the word discrimination. And that is what I would suggest you need to read and cover to basically understand this learning outcome in a bit more detail. So that brings us to the end of today's session. This presentation is obviously on Moodle. A copy of the recording should be available to you in a couple of minutes. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me now. Otherwise, you can also discuss and write those questions down, and we can discuss them when we look at discussing the third learning outcome next week. Any questions on this so far? Okay, that's great. So if there are no questions, I'll end the session, and then I'll catch up with you next week on Friday.